Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Architectural Association. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the screening of Temptation of Influence, a film by Marko Milovanovic. Marko developed this film as part of a project initiated by the Royal Academy of Art, which was made in collaboration with Architecture at the Edge. And it was for the 2024 Shane de Blacam Architecture Fellowship. And it had additional support from the British Council, the Arts Council for Ireland, and the Architectural Association. As well as being a filmmaker, Marko is a curator and a teacher here at the AA of Intermediate 7. And after this evening screening, he'll be joined in conversation by Ernest Fasanya. Ernest is a director at Hopkins Architects, and recent projects include the Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities at the University of Oxford. And Ernest was actually one of the first people to introduce Marko to practice once he had graduated from the AA. So it feels very, very fitting that you'll be in conversation tonight after the screening. So without further ado, I will hand over to Marko to introduce Temptation of Influence. Thank you, Marko.
Well, thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Molly, for all your help. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I think Harriet pretty much said everything. I just wanted to say thank all the collaborators. You'll see all of their names at the start of the film, so I'm not going to list them. One of them is here, Paolo, just walked in. Thank you for your help. And I think I just want to make a point about film as a medium, that often in this room, we look at work, but work is not in the room. Work is kind of on the screen, and we kind of discuss works of design and art and architecture, but they're not in the room. And an amazing thing about film is that the work is in the room. It occupies the space. And so I just want you to kind of, and that's why I think it's nice that it's not very common that we screen films. And so I think maybe that's just something to ponder on as the film is unfolding. But yeah, I just hope you enjoy it. I don't want to say anything else. And yeah, and I'm going to press a button.
John wanted to do a white stone building like Alto. T.S. Eliot said that dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did, but it is precisely they that we know. While John loved Alto, Shane loved Kahn, or Lou, as he called him. I cut that corner there, Shane pointed at the entrance of the building, just like Lou did on the Mellon building. Shane also pointed at the stainless steel windowsills and said nothing about Lou regarding that detail. Some months later, I would come to wonder about a similar detail on Lou's building in New Haven. Lou revealed a void within his bent windowsill on the ground floor. I was puzzled by it until I discovered the same detail in the handrail of the staircase inside. I was forbidden to take a picture of it, as the building was under refurbishment, but it occurred to me that the void was very intentional. We are presented with the thinness and therefore the strength of the material that encloses the entire building. Lou wanted to show us how this seemingly heavy facade is actually very thin. I seem to remember seeing something similar near Vicenza. What has Lou seen, I wondered, and where? Thinking of the white stone building in Dublin, I then remembered that Shane and John did express the thickness of the material that clad the building. I should have asked Shane about this, and whether he himself, when working for Lou as a young architect, produced drawings for the empty windowsill on the Mellon building. Wandering around Trinity College in Dublin, where Shane and John have built a number of projects, one might begin to ask, how does a young architect find a voice? Some might think that the secret to this is to become very large, like the rabbit in Wallace Stevens' poem, Rabbit, as king of the ghosts. It grows so large, it dominates everything around it. Some might feel that that's the way to stand out. But to find a voice, an architect often must do quite the opposite. To compromise, to give away the imaginative scope, to peel layers off, to shrink in size, and to make space for others. By giving space out, an architect carves out space for themselves, setting themselves apart from others, including their predecessors and their teachers.
Hi, everybody. That is the fourth time that I've seen the film since June. And each time I watch it, I see different things. So I've tried to collect some sort of prompts or provocations for Marko. I don't know what everybody thought, but just on a sort of surface level, I think it's an incredibly well-made film. And I'd like to congratulate Marko and his collaborators.
Thank you.
For what they've achieved, as well as knowing Marko, I also know Fergus, who did the narration, who also worked at Hopkins for many years, and I thought the way that he narrated it was like a fantastic literal voice, but also just the way in which he phrased it and told a story, I suppose, was really central to this. But I think there are other things as well. So I've got a sort of two main registers that I'd like to kind of talk about in the film in. One is to do with the architecture, but the other is to do with actual filmmaking as well. And I thought that the point that you made about the film being something that's in the room with us was a really interesting one, because films are in the room with you, but they are also showing you another world. They are a window to something else, and I think that relationship is also incredibly important, particularly when you're talking about influence, and when you're talking about what for me seems to be constant substitution. And what I mean by that, and this is my sort of first provocation. When the film started, I didn't really know where you were going, and we were looking at that sort of salvage, sort of amazing sort of space where you had sort of objects at different scales. So you had like the doll's house, you had bits of furniture, bits of sort of architecture and so on. And you were talking about Peter and his grandmother. And you made the point that a poet has to choose an object to tell a story. And I was like, what's this got to do with what you're doing? But what you then went on to do was to talk about, if you want to know Shane, you need to know Dublin. But actually, in order to know Dublin, you need to know Shane. And in a way, although this might sound rude, Shane becomes a kind of object, if you like, that you as the poet have chosen. And I thought that was actually a really good introduction. Because of what it does, in a way, there are sort of two kind of literary terms which I think are kind of relevant to this. One is metonymy and the other one's synecdoche. And they're about the way in which you use an object to talk about a much bigger thing. And I thought that the way in which you then led that into talking about Pope, talking about Virgil, talking about Homer, was obviously a kind of parallel, if you like, with Níall and Sheila and Peter, talking about Shane, talking about Lou and so on. And so this whole thing where it's a kind of chain of substitutions of people speaking about other people or through other people, I thought was really, incredibly well done. What it makes me sort of wonder, and is obviously you've made a film and you situate yourself as a filmmaker. but you are also in a chain of people that, you know, who are your influences in terms of you making this film, and what do you think people will take away as a kind of influence?
I mean, yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, I maybe just go back slightly to what you said in terms of the object revealing the place, and maybe I should say that in terms of filmmaking, I have kind of taught myself, and I've taught myself by teaching my students. So here at the AA, we work with film as an important part of the methodology, Fergus and I, and over the years we've had these discussions and understood how actually what film does and how it does. And certainly, like if I was just to really just do a series of bullet points of my own influences, I mean, I think definitely the film sits in the kind of context of people like Adam Curtis, Patrick Keeler, Chris Marker, and then more recent filmmakers like Miranda Pannell. So these are maybe, I'd say, filmic influences. But of course, there are also architectural influences, and that's where me and you are connected. And I think I would just also kind of honor your contribution, because that kind of attention to detail is something that I guess one only can learn once you've done it and repeatedly drawn it, and that's how you learn how to look at buildings. Is, you know, when you've drawn them repeatedly and you've kind of drawn shadow gaps and you realize the impact of a 25 mil shadow gap on a building that is, you know, 100 meters long. And so, yes, I think the influences are both filmic but also architectural.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. Actually, it sort of slightly leads me on to the sort of second thing I was going to ask, which was, I thought it was brilliant the way that you or Fergus talks about one's not born an architect, you become an architect by working with or for another architect. Then, in other words, you have to be an apprentice in a way that doesn't really happen to poets or novelists or, you know, people who are making other kinds of art. But it does happen, or certainly used to happen, to artists in the way that you had the school of so-and-so and so on, and people were learning how to be artists, and it happens to craftsmen. So I suppose the question that I would be asking is what is it that, as an architect, learning to be an architect, that you have to do? What is it that makes you an apprentice in a way that a poet can read another poet's work, or a novelist can read another novelist's work, doesn't have to sit in the same room with them and absorb what it is that they're being taught? So what's the difference there?
I think it's the surrendering of ego. I think that's what you need to do as an architect. In that process, there's always that point where you actually surrender ego, where you're there really in the service of someone else. And in that moment of surrendering the ego, you're actually learning a lot. And I think that is really critical. I mean, we sit here at the AA, we pride ourselves in this school that we produce people that might just start to practice after they, you know, get their diploma at the end of 5th year or even 3rd year. But the truth is, buildings take years to build. And in that process, it's a learning process, and I think knowledge comes from people that have done it before, and so it's a slightly controversial point. I do wonder how it might land in this room. It has landed very nicely in Ireland, where I think people understand that as part of the culture, but it's maybe I'm curious about here.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, again, there was the whole thing about the Wallace Stevens, you know, Rabbit as the Ghost King. You know that, you know, at one point, you know, do you make yourself big? You know, not naming any particular grandiose architects, but do you make yourself, that sort of star architect, or do you withdraw, as you described it, you give other people space so that you can then create your own space? And I suppose the thing I then thought was actually quite interesting about that is that you're doing all that, you're losing ego, etc. But at the same time, throughout the film, you do talk about betrayal. You talk about misreading. And it's almost as though there's a sort of ambivalence in terms of how much you are going to be influenced by someone and how much you have to strike out on your own or do something that is a misreading or is a, and I suppose it was. It's almost like, when Níall talks about, there are lovely things about Kahn and Shane, but there are some things that really get me and I don't really, and it's like, would he have that conversation directly with Shane, or, to what extent are you disobedient? To what extent are you losing your ego when you're learning to become an architect, and how that gets expressed? Because when you talked about that sill detail, and I thought, again, one of the sort of beautiful things about the film were the number of rhymes and rhythms that you were using visually, as well as the way in which the dialogue was moving. Sometimes the dialogue would be talking about a different building while you were looking at another image. But in the instance I'm thinking about, when you talked about the sills, the sill that Shane had used on the building of St Stephen's Green, the one at the Yale Centre for British Art, and then the one in Vicenza that you'd seen, the stone one. But you said that Shane pointed at it, but he didn't talk about it. He didn't want to say anything about it. And again, was that the I referenced it, but I don't actually want to talk about the fact that I didn't do the same.
And there were
thing
certain things he did talk about, such as the corner opening.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm quite interested in when you sort of, now that I've watched it several times, is the way that the visibility of that influence seems to be something that changes quite a lot. So there are certain things where there's a hidden influence which can become visible. And there are other things where the influence is talked about, but you can't actually see it in the work. So one of the things I noticed about the cork thing, and it only came across almost kind of obliquely when you talked about Shane with his partner going to Finlandia Hall, that Alto Scandinavia was an important element. Yeah, a reference. But when you look at the court building, there's an almost direct reference to Klippan in that building. Yeah, and so there, exactly. This is Sigurd Leverent's building in the south of Sweden. So there are other sort of hidden influences that don't necessarily get expressed, but at the same time there are expressed influences that don't seem to be very obvious. So the Palladio thing is not something that I see in his work, and yet it surrounds his study. Yeah. So that sort of the way in which the influences seem to be either expressed or not expressed seems to be quite important.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of, I mean, that's why that's in the film, because it was not obvious in his work at all, the Palladio influence, yet it's so present in that room. And, I didn't actually, it took me a while to acknowledge the presence of Palladio in the room. We were there having lunch, and, Palladio was a wallpaper, a kind of distant landscape. It wasn't really dominant. Really, Kahn was so dominant, those sketches that Shane really, the monumentalized Shane himself and his connection to Kahn, who he calls Lou. But then as we kind of sat there and spoke and met, and at some point Kahn just appeared, Palladio just appeared, and I say that in the film. And I haven't really explored it too much with Shane, but I guess it's actually a point that Kenneth Frampton came and said to me after the premiere at the Royal Academy, that's something that hasn't really been explored very much, is this connection between Kahn and Palladio via Ireland. And he said, that's a real contribution. Yeah, so I think, and I think maybe it goes back to your earlier point about filmmaking is a creative process, and through this creative process of filmmaking, you actually make connections that you weren't expecting or intending, and that happened throughout the film. And if I even go further back to the first question, that's even this salvage place was probably the last place I visited before kind of starting to really lay out the film, and it was just so powerfully embodying the film because it was just scattered pieces of architecture everywhere, components. And finally, if I can link that to your point about misreading and the use of the word misreading and betrayal, I plant those words because I think they're important because, firstly, I don't believe that we fully understand what anyone means. I mean, nor maybe the people that do things really know fully why they've done it. And then we always project meaning onto things, and we project reading onto things. And so, I always feel that by default, we are in this process of misreading. And I actually offer misreading as a glimmer of hope for architects to kind of find ways in which they can confidently be innovative and future-looking, but also not feel like past is a burden. But it's okay, like maybe we just misread it, and but maybe not in a postmodernist way.
No, I think that's a nice sort of segue into the film aspects. I mean, obviously, time is completely intrinsic to films. That's in a way why they're sort of different, if you like, or one of the key ways in which they're different from just images or static pictures. And I thought that the way in which you talked about time in two ways was actually really interesting. So the first one I thought was the way in which you kind of talked about almost sort of slow time or time connected with geology. So the way in which you talked about Inishmaan and the way that the fields are made with the seaweed and the shale, but then the way in which you talked about concrete and the way the concrete, obviously, one in the sense of it being sort of discovered, and I think you used the phrase, it was just an observation. Concrete at one point was just an observation about a process.
Natural process.
Yes, about a natural process, but then obviously becomes embodied in a building that becomes completely seminal, and as being, copied in various ways, and even the idea of the oculus then beginning to appear in so many different buildings, and and you see it in the Cork building, for example. So that idea of sort of time, I thought was very interesting, but also the way in which you talked about that relationship between the past and the present. And that one can affect the other. So almost in a way that, very often we don't really think of it that way. Generally, the past affects what you're doing now rather than the way that you can affect the past, because the past, it doesn't in a sense really exist. It's what you're thinking of as the past. So I thought that was very interesting. But the way it applies to film, I thought, was particularly kind of interesting. So, for example, I didn't know whether what looked like old film was old film, like Shane's film, or whether it was film that you had made. And I think the fact that it becomes completely, you're at its mercy in a sense. You're looking at a screen, but you don't actually know what its provenance is, But I mean, was that film the way you'd filmed it, or was it film that you'd got from somewhere else, for example?
Well, that was the film that we filmed. In fact, William Whitaker, who's a former student, he filmed it in the Chancellor.
Right. Okay. So again, there was a sort of like, is this historic, or are we looking at something that's just happened, and making that kind of suddenly making you look at it in a different way, completely played into the idea of you're looking at the past in a different way, simply because of the way that you'd filmed it. And then that leads me to, and I'm sure a lot of people would have ask themselves this question, particular ways that you filmed it. So obviously there's the color and black and white, but for me, it's often you would see people speaking, but you couldn't hear them, but you could hear Fergus, and you didn't know whether he was saying what they were saying. And I would just like to explore that a little bit as to why that was important for you to do.
Well, that's exactly one of the things that I really didn't think about at all, for instance. So this is what kind of this dynamic medium that is then interpreted by 120 people in the room in different ways. It has that power to be misread. So you've just misread my intention, but at the same time you've opened up another possibility. So there was not a conscious that was not conscious at all. But I now can think about it. So I think what's interesting is that work sometimes lives, and you discover it. As you know, with buildings, you discover things you've done that you weren't really intending.
No, that's very true. Right, okay, that's me done. Do we want to open up questions to the floor? Has anybody got any things that sparked, or any observations about the film? Dumbstruck. Oh no.
Hi.
Hello.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
I was interested in the connection with the comments about ego and Palladio, because that period was the invention of ego in the first place. And so I just found that a really interesting junction. I found lots of things interesting, but that's the point to get the questions going.
That's very interesting. It is the invention of ego, and in fact, the Hadrian's pantheon is attributed to Hadrian, who is an emperor, and to Agrippa, who is a military person in Augustan Rome. So it was not those buildings were not attributed to their architects.
Yes, and the other aspect of, say, something like the Pantheon is the cosmological context in which the architects are operating, which any good architect operates within that as context. So, I mean, I'm sure Shane has that aspiration as well.
Well, I should say something interesting about Shane and his ego. I mean, he's not here, but he's a really wonderful man and very generous, and probably big, strong ego, but really hasn't really spoken very much about his architecture. He's not very well known. I think we should say that. I mean, he's not very well known outside of Ireland. At the same time, he had taught a generation of amazing Irish architects like Sheila O'Donnell, Níall McLaughlin, and obviously has interacted and nourished the generation of Irish architects that include Shelley McNamara and others, and Yvonne Farrell. And Shane has not spoken very much about his buildings. He has not gone around given lots of lectures, and I think there's something interesting in that. It's a work that's being discovered, and I would also go back to earlier point Ernest made, that in a way Shane is almost an object through which a wider question of this dialogue within the profession is revealed. So I think that's why Shane is a good person.
I mean, at his, when he gave his lecture to the Royal Academy, that when they gave him the prize, he did talk for a few minutes before he then sort of went through his projects, in which he sort of said, that the buildings need to speak for themselves. And actually, very often when architects talk about their work, I think he talked about Louis Kahn being excruciating. I mean, this is a guy that he obviously was extremely influenced by, worked for many years, but he said when he tried to explain his buildings, it was excruciating. And he found the cult that grew around Louis Kahn actually very, I think, offensive. I think he thought that Louis was a much more normal person, actually, than the cult that grew around him, and the sort of, almost sort of, sort of sacred sort of way in which Kahn was addressed. I think he found Kahn a much more normal kind of guy, and actually, talking about architecture with him, etc., was okay. But when he then pontificated or had to do his lectures, you sort of slipped into this sort of mystical speak, which I think Shane found very, very difficult to understand and didn't really connect with the buildings that they were designing.
I guess another thing about Shane and Kahn is that, or Shane, yeah, really, I think I just want to reinforce what you said, that he thinks that buildings should speak for themselves, and he's a kind of person that would just wonder why architects need to explain things. I guess they have to explain things to clients and stuff, but why does an architect have to come and justify things? And I think partially I've embodied a little bit of that in the film. I haven't really, I guess I haven't really spoken too much about buildings, but I've presented buildings and I've said what he said, and I've tried to kind of stay in the space of what's been kind of communicated to me and what's visible.
I mean, just bringing it a bit back to Hopkins. I mean, that's one of the things I think that Shane kind of shared with Michael Hopkins, that he wasn't a great pontificator, and for him, I think for a lot of the time, he wanted to get to a building that was kind of not exactly obvious, but it didn't need to be explained, and that the idea of it being legible, being clear, that there was a kind of obviousness to it was the end goal. And if you had to spend a long time explaining why it was, then you probably weren't on the right track.
That was such an interesting film, Marko. It's made me think all sorts of things. But the one thing I noticed was that in talking about Shane, you talk about the people who influenced him much more than the people he influenced. And it made me wonder if younger generations in this room have the same attitude to influence. And yes, I suppose I'm asking you that question rather than Marko. But in a way, you chose to do that. You chose to go back rather than forwards. Do you think it's still true when you look at your students? Are they thinking about influence in the same way that we were taught in my generation? Look at this detail. Look at the way he did that. Look at the way, quote, 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 quote. I don't think that happens anymore. But I may be wrong, so I'd be interested to see if the idea of influence has actually evolved.
I mean, that's a fundamental question. I think when I was in Ireland, Irish architects who when we had screened the film, they would say that every first-year student should see this. Every Irish first-year student in architecture school should see this. And every time they said that, I was slightly uncomfortable, because I actually said, I'm not sure. I'm not actually sure if this is for them, because I do think it requires some time spent in practice for all the ideas that I've put into the film to resonate. A lot of those ideas come from my time at Hopkins, where, as a young person, you don't necessarily get what you think you'll get from working in a big practice, but you learn so much, and it's a real realization of, in the process of making the film, of how much I learned at Hopkins. So I don't know if young generations, I don't know, maybe we don't teach the way you were taught, which is also maybe okay.
Well, maybe you've got to sort of throw them in the deep end a bit. I mean, Shane said that I was sort of privileged to be able to sort of have a chat with him at the end of last week, and he said, when I was teaching first year, we tried to fail as few students as possible. The ones we thought we were struggling, their punishment was they either got 6 months or 12 months in Italy. It was up to you to work out which was the shorter or the longer one that was the punishment. So it was very much about sort of throwing them in the deep end and actually just make them see architecture, and that they'll either be influenced or they won't, but they will definitely come back quoting something. So I think it's about exposure.
Yeah. And I should also say something about like that. Part of our justification for using and working with film in our design studio here is that film is a pointed looking, you know, it's an intentional looking, and that's you know, maybe if you know, methodologies involve lens and look, you're forced to actually know why and what you're observing. So yeah, we also need to know how to look and what to look at and what to look for.
I mean, we live in the world of, well, I don't particularly, but my younger peers and certainly my children live in the world of memes, and that is incredibly referential. So I do think that they are referring. There is in some, you know, there's an irony, or there's a wanting to quote, or to, you know, to do those things. It's there. I think it's a natural tendency.
Hey, I'm interested in the idea of voice. I think you mentioned just before that you were trying to stay quite close to what was communicated to you, especially you coming from interviewing people a lot and having your own YouTube channel about interviews. And I think that we spoke in the past how the way that you interview is basically you just start anywhere, you let it roll, and then the conversation is kind of an ongoing conversation, and it just stays crystallized somewhere for someone to access it. And I think this film is exactly the opposite, which is a very edited conversation where the voice of the people you're interviewing are not even rendered in the video. It's a voice that you create, but also it's not your voice, which is in the video. And I was wondering if you, at any point, felt any tension in creating this video, given your background.
Yeah, I mean, very much it was an evolution of what I would normally do, which is just have a really relaxed, long conversation. But it really had to be very intentional. And I think it showed me that I can also be rigorous in certain ways. And I think it was needed, that rigor was needed. And that's why it's a single voice, and you don't hear any of these characters, but their voice is kind of narrated. Yeah. And you know, there's also a point in the film where I say finding a voice, and actually you just now made me think about that. When you started your question, I thought you would talk about kind of finding an architectural voice. And I think that there's also something interesting in that. And there's one there and one there, and maybe that's...
When you talk about influence, like it comes across stylistically in terms of what people see, how they represent that. Do you think there's an element of sort of technological influence or progress within that? Because as sort of new methods of constructing, new materials become available, the way in which you actually have to do things changes. I think Ernest's point about Michael Hopkins and how he read buildings and used the materials around him to build that, you know, you could apply the same thing all the way back to Palladio, and then actually sort of looking forwards, seeing how you integrate new technologies, new sustainability principles and credentials. Like, do you see that influence being more than stylistic?
Oh no, absolutely, and I think that's why it was really important to mention concrete. I mean, again, it came naturally. It's something it's an idea I've been pondering on, but you know, certainly, I think we are paralyzed if we are not able to use concrete. But then the question is how we use it, how long those buildings would last. Pantheon's been there for 2,000 years. Absolutely, it's a very critical point. And yes, of course, then I guess that's the great thing. You guys have such a privilege of working on buildings that have a cultural resonance at Hopkins that are likely to last long, because they also have that, design component, that additional element of thoughtfulness that means that the building may last longer. That is very important. Yeah, something architects need to learn and know.
Sorry, yeah, I'm just thinking. I mean, okay, I'll give you an example of what was sort of going through my mind when you said that. When we did the mound stand, it's almost like a kind of
Lord's Cricket
at Lord's Cricket Ground, and it's a sort of, the building is a lightweight superstructure that's sunk over 19th century Victorian arches and a stand, and in a sense it's almost like a short history of architecture across a sort of 100 years or so. But the thing that I thought was very interesting about it was that part of what we did on the top was referencing, and that's because Michael was very interested in tensile membranes, and he was a very boat person, and so was very familiar with that sort of gadgetry. Let's put it that way. So for him, it sort of came easy. But when he sort of described the canopies and the whole thing that he was trying to achieve, he went back to the idea of that for hundreds of years around cricket grounds, you would have a beer tent. And so for him, this was both things at the same time. It was something that was like technologically very innovative, but at the same time, it was sort of thematically actually very simple to understand. And I think that's the slight, if you can make that work, that's when it really works with lots and lots of people, because you can do things that are kind of very exciting and innovative, or parametric, for example, but if you're not making a connection to something that's a bit more basic or familiar or everyday for other people, or a different metaphor that you can use that isn't just about the excitement of technology, then it's not going to work. I mean, it's a bit like the way that, F1 cars are incredible things, but in a sense, they're still actually just chariots. Yeah, so that's really what I mean.
Time for one more question. Yeah. There's one there.
I think I have a misreading to offer, and I felt like the film shed light on referencing and observing the echoes of history in buildings. And perhaps underlying that was the lack of literacy, perhaps of young architects just graduating, or maybe even a lack of an illiteracy of buildings in the wider context of in sort of just ordinary people. Perhaps we're not trying hard enough. I'm not sure, but it seems that I wonder if you could, if somewhere in the shadows of the film, there's something to be said about how this is a conversation that's very contained in the architectural profession. We're trying to communicate with architects, sort of architects talking to architects. What about architects trying to communicate with others outside of the profession? And maybe is it linked to the word temptation? A big misreading. interpret as you?
Yeah, I mean, there's many layers to this question. I guess on one level, I use a lot of references in the way I speak about architecture. I use a lot of linguistic references. I connect architecture to influences famously articulated by Harold Bloom as something that poets grapple with and struggle with. And that's very much kind of present. And actually, I feel like what I've tried, in some way, what I did behind the scenes is to bring some of those ways in which, let's say, literary theory talks about literature to talk about architecture and try to basically overlap those two ways of thinking and see where we can learn. So in some ways, in that sense, I try to open up a conversation that maybe doesn't, or I haven't really recognized. But in terms of how much this, or like what this offers to the public that is outside of the profession, I think it offers them exactly what literary theory offered me, Because what literary theory offered me was another way of thinking that I'm not a literary critic or theorist, but my mind was open enough, or I was listening, and I kind of took something, and so I hope that in this maybe cryptic language and kind of complex references and slightly indulgent, professionally indulgent, maybe a narrative, someone actually will recognize something that will apply, perhaps, I hope.
Yeah. I haven't got anything to add to that.
Okay. Well, I think there are still many questions in the room because I saw so many hands raised, but we're going to serve some drinks at the back of the lecture hall, so hopefully you can get a chance to ask those questions and keep chatting more informally. But for now, please join me in thanking Marko and Ernest. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ernest. Thank you.
Thank you, Marko.